Welcome to today's webinar, which provides an overview of the draft advice on the National Suicide Prevention Strategy. I'm Susan Edgar. I'm Chair of the Lived Experience Partnership Group for the National Suicide Prevention Office, and I'll be your MC today. I would like to start by acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting across Australia today. I offer my thanks to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who contributed to the development of the strategy. We are grateful for the leadership, generosity and wisdom that have characterised their contributions. I would like to recognise individuals joining us today with lived and living experience of suicide. People who experience suicidal thoughts, have survived suicide attempts, cared for a person in suicidal distress, or lost a loved one to suicide. Every person's journey is unique and a valued contribution to Australia's commitment to suicide prevention reform, and I thank you for joining us today. I want to start today's webinar with a brief reflection as Chair of the Lived Experience Partnership Group. This group was formed in late 2022 and set to work in partnership with the National Suicide Prevention Office to ensure that lived experience was embedded in the heart of what we hope will go on to be endorsed as the National Suicide Prevention Strategy. We know that as well as the work of our group and the Advisory Board, whose members you'll also hear from today, the strategy development builds on widespread consultation and previous work, including a consultation piece drawing on the voices of over 3,000 people with lived experience of suicide. Members of our group have been open and reflective in their feedback on multiple iterations of the draft document and know that it will be further strengthened through the public consultation process now underway. We've felt listened to as we've worked with the office and believe the draft advice on the National Suicide Prevention Strategy firmly reflects a call for change that will save lives. The Lived Experience Partnership Group really comes from a position of hope that the strategy, when endorsed, will provide clear guidance for communities, services and governments on a comprehensive, compassionate national approach to suicide prevention moving forward. Now to an outline of today's webinar, and I do want to just set the scene a little bit. We're having a few IT issues here, so we hope that everything runs smoothly. But in today's webinar, we're going to be giving an overview of the draft advice on the National Suicide Prevention Strategy and the fundamental change it proposes to the way we think and act on suicide prevention. We will be speaking about how the draft advice on the strategy brings together first-hand experiences of people with lived and living experience of suicide, the latest research and recommendations from existing inquiries and reports to lay out a path that will deliver a reduction in the number of lives lost to suicide nationally. Shortly, I'll be handing over to Dr. Michael Gardner, Head of the National Suicide Prevention Office. We were also hoping to hear from Rachel Fishlock, who couldn't be with us personally today, but had made a short video recording. We're having a little bit of trouble with the IT at the moment. And then we're going to speak with our guest panellists, Dr. Alan Woodward and Nevis Murray. If time permits, we'll respond to a few questions as well, so please feel free to use the Q&A function. And anything we don't get to, the office will update responses to in the FAQ document on the consultation platform. So Dr. Michael Gardner, thank you for all the work you and the team at the NSPO have done thus far to get the strategy to where it is. I will now hand over to you to share a bit about its development and what the strategy contains.
Thank you all for joining us and for your interest in the draft National Suicide Prevention Strategy. The strategy is which was released last week on World Suicide Prevention Day, is the first major piece of work from the National Suicide Prevention Office. So the team and I are really delighted to be providing you with this overview today. My main objective this morning is just to give you an overview of what the strategy contains and to highlight some of the key thinking that shaped its development. So the first question to ask is, why do we need a strategy? And I think probably everyone will know that the obvious answer is that the number of lives lost to suicide in Australia each year and the number of people who experience suicidal self-harm or attempt to take their own lives is really unacceptable. The impact on some groups and communities is particularly devastating. I won't go into those statistics which are on the screen in any great detail because I'm sure that you already are familiar with them. But what is clear from these statistics is that our current approach is clearly not working. The findings from the Productivity Commission and the final advice and many other reports recognize that in order to change these statistics, we really need a new approach to preventing suicide. So traditionally, suicide has been regarded as primarily about individual mental health, and the response has been largely focused on individualized medical responses to people in suicidal crisis. But this approach doesn't really align with a contemporary understanding of suicide. People with lived experience of suicide, the data and the scientific research all tell us that suicidal thoughts and behaviors are not just about mental ill health, they are also about the circumstances that people live in that can create feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and entrapment. These may include things like financial stress, housing instability, domestic family violence, childhood adversity, discrimination, alcohol and drug harm. And the statistic I most often cite to illustrate the importance of these factors is that 48% of all suicides in Australia have been linked to 4 modifiable risk factors: child abuse and neglect, alcohol use, drug use, and intimate partner violence against women. And these are all preventable. I just wanted to talk to you quickly to give you some background on how the strategy was developed. Susan mentioned people with lived and living experience, but to develop a strategy that is aligned with a more contemporary understanding of suicide and which seeks to outline an approach that has the greatest impact on the rates of intentional self-harm, suicide, and suicide deaths. We really undertook an extensive collaborative design process, and that began with using 35 existing reports, including the Productivity Commission inquiry into mental health and the Suicide Prevention Advisor's final advice. And we have supported that with academic reviews, evidence briefs, and research to ensure that the actions in the strategy are firmly grounded in evidence. The Lived Experience Partnership Group that Susan chairs and our advisory board, which Alan Woodward chairs, have been pivotal in shaping and further developing the advice and recommendations. We've also done extensive targeted consultations with various groups, including men, young people, older people, the LGBTIQ+ community, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, people who are deaf and hard of hearing, people with disabilities, people living and working in regional and remote areas, and participants at the Roses in the Ocean's Lived Experience Summit. And then lastly, because responsibility for suicide prevention is shared across governments and portfolios, the strategy has been developed in close consultation with our colleagues in the states and territories and across the whole of the federal government. So I know some of the members of the groups that we've consulted with are present here today, so I would just like to acknowledge the immense generosity with which you've shared your expertise. The model of that the national strategy describes, and what this really describes is the essential components of an effective suicide prevention system that firstly acts to prevent people from reaching the point of suicidal distress in the first place by taking proactive steps to address areas of disadvantage and adversity that contribute to distress. Secondly, that strengthens the support system to ensure that when a person does experience suicidal distress, support is accessible, compassionate, and effective. And thirdly, a system that is sustained by collective effort from government sectors beyond health, service providers, and communities. And I will go into each of these in a little more detail. So the first one is the prevention of suicidal distress. And as I mentioned earlier, a truly preventative approach can only be achieved if we turn our attention to addressing some of the social determinants of suicidal distress. And this is the subject of this first domain. And there are two approaches we can take. The first, which is really covered in the second layer down there, which is addressing the drivers of distress. We can reduce adverse experiences that people face that contribute to suicidal distress. Simply treating people and then returning them to untenable situations, like situations of domestic family violence, is not going to be an effective approach. But beyond this, if you look at that first layer, we can proactively build protective factors in the whole population through enhancing well-being. So practically what this does is bring into focus the importance of enhancing personal safety, including by addressing family domestic violence, discrimination, racism, child abuse, and neglect. Secondly, by ensuring good mental and physical health, particularly for people with severe and complex mental illness or substance use disorders. By providing economic security, including access to secure employment and housing, which we know are critical in suicide. Building a more inclusive society, as well as addressing loneliness and social exclusion. And by providing better support for key life transitions, such as leaving the workforce, coming out, family and relationship breakdown, and bereavement, among many other life changes. I just want to point out two particular aspects of this approach that we've taken. Firstly, the strategy takes a human rights-based approach that focuses on equity. In other words, it's not about creating a utopian ideal, but about really focusing efforts on eliminating pockets of extreme disadvantage and adversity that we know contribute to suffering and to suicidal distress. Secondly, it is about recognizing that there are many different populations and communities that are disproportionately impacted by suicide. But rather than having different strategies for each group, this approach recognizes that by focusing on the underlying determinants, we can implement an adaptable framework which recognizes intersectionality. So this second domain, the support domain, really is focused on ensuring that when people do experience suicidal thoughts and behaviors, that they can connect to safe and effective supports. And the strategy frames this support around the essential components that must be in place in every service, in every part of the system, and across the system as a whole. And these key elements are a compassionate approach. This means that there must be efforts to reduce barriers to engagement with support, and that involves reducing knowledge and access to means, ensuring that both informal and formal interactions are not laden with unhelpful and unsafe stigma and discrimination, and that people's agency in their own care is respected. It means that services must be accessible. That means obviously that they must be locally available and affordable and timely, but also that they provide safe and acceptable care for particular groups, LGBTIQ+, CALD, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in particular. Supports should be coordinated. I think many people will know and have experience of the fact that having to navigate various health services in the system, manage referrals and appointments, and re-explain yourself is exhausting when you're well and basically impossible when you are in suicidal crisis. So we actually really need services to work together better. We need care coordinators and peer workers to assist with creating facilitated journeys of care in order to ensure that the supports offered are effective. We also need holistic supports, which is to say that we need services that address a full range of needs. So rather than just treating a person presenting with suicidal thoughts and behaviors from a mental health perspective, we need to understand what is happening for them, whether they have legal housing issues or financial issues or issues with domestic family violence or alcohol drug issues. We need to understand what's going on, and we need to address those fundamental drivers within the context of the health system. And then lastly, we need services and supports that promote increased connection. This means involving chosen family, carers and kin when necessary, and that we explore mechanisms to reconnect people with their communities, which are so critical in building well-being. The critical enablers, this third domain of the strategy is really describing what is required to make those first two domains actually possible and to ensure that they are sustained and maintained at a good and effective level. And this revolves around really improving how governments and portfolios think about suicide prevention and how they work together to create a more effective and sustainable approach to suicide prevention nationally. It is about embedding lived and living experience into decision making by really improving the capability of policy makers and creating cultures and organizational structures that support and sustain the engagement with people with lived experience. And then obviously we need to improve the data. We know that in order for governments to deliver effective suicide prevention, or in fact any other type of services, we need to know where people live, what services they require, what services they use, and where the gaps are. And in suicide prevention, we have a large number of pieces of the puzzle that are missing. So we can invest more in research, we can strengthen the way we evaluate our programs and services, and we can improve how rapidly we translate that into practical supports. And then largely, obviously, we need a capable and integrated workforce to sustain both the prevention and support domains of the strategy. And this is obviously a huge piece of work. So the strategy really suggests that we need a much more extensive workforce strategy that focuses on the suicide prevention sector and really builds the workforce and sustains and supports the workforce across the whole spectrum. That includes both formal and informal supports as well. So returning to the overall model, in a nutshell, the strategy really seeks, and if I can use Susan's words, to put prevention back into suicide prevention, while at the same time ensuring more compassionate, comprehensive and effective supports, and then underpinning this with a robust administrative scaffolding. From my perspective, the strategy describes what is needed to make significant progress in suicide prevention in Australia. It is wide-ranging, it is complex, it does require collective effort from all governments, agencies, services, communities, and all members of the community. We need to recognise our role in suicide prevention and work together to achieve lasting change. And then finally, I would just like to quickly thank everyone who has contributed to the development of the strategy. It has really been an incredibly collaborative and collective effort, and every consultation, every meeting, every conversation we have had has helped to inform our thinking and strengthen the advice we are providing. The development of this strategy has highlighted that there is a really firm and common ground in suicide prevention and a very united national voice. It is now time to make a change. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And I do believe that we do have availability of the video that Rachel Fishlock from Gaia Dewey, Proud Spirit Australia, put together. She couldn't be here live today, but wanted to provide us with a video. So I'm hoping that's going to start.
Hello everyone, my name is Rachel Fishlock and I'm a proud descendant of the Yuin Nation and the CEO of Gaia Dewey, Proud Spirit Australia. Today I'd like to discuss the relationship between the National Suicide Prevention Strategy and the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Strategy, which we call the NAPSS for short, and how these strategies work together to address the critical issue of suicide prevention in Australia. Firstly, it's important to acknowledge the role of Gaia Dewey, the national peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social emotional wellbeing, mental health and suicide prevention. As a community-controlled organisation, Gaia Dewey is governed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experts and peak bodies promoting collective excellence in mental health care. The organisation's vision, derived from the Gaia Dewey Proud Spirit Declaration, emphasises leadership, excellence and presence across the Australian mental health system to achieve the highest attainable standard of social emotional wellbeing, mental health and suicide prevention outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Strategy, led by Gaia Dewey, is a renewed effort to address the unique challenges faced by these communities. The strategy's development involved extensive consultations, including submissions, roundtables, and thematic analysis, resulting in 6 key priority areas: leadership and self-determination, thriving communities, informed and supportive communities, culturally safe and coordinated care, and responsive workforce, and evidence and data. For the strategy to be effective, 3 enabling factors are crucial: sustained, flexible, and targeted funding, effective implementation, and robust governance, monitoring and evaluation. The renewed NAPSS aims to foster genuine partnerships between governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to drive culturally safe and responsive solutions. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities face unique challenges in the context of mental health and suicide, shaped by cultural, historical and systemic factors. These challenges require tailored approaches that are culturally informed and sensitive. While both the NAPSS and the National Suicide Prevention Strategy share the overarching goal of reducing suicide rates, their approaches and focuses differ. The National Suicide Prevention Strategy provides a broad framework for all Australians, whereas the NAPSS is specifically tailored toward Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, emphasising culturally responsive and community-led initiatives. We've been working with the National Suicide Prevention Office to ensure alignment between the NAPSS and the National Suicide Prevention Strategy, as they will be most effective when implemented alongside each other. It is encouraging to see the national strategy emphasise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander concepts of social emotional wellbeing as a key source of leadership and guidance for more holistic approaches to suicide prevention across the population. The strategy also describes approaches to cross-government accountability, lived experience leadership, evidence and evaluation, and workforce development intended to align with the goals of the NAPSS. Furthermore, the National Suicide Prevention Strategy aligns with long-standing efforts to increase recognition of the importance of social emotional wellbeing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which is included as a target within the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. Moreover, the national strategy addresses the inequalities that give us rise to the disproportionate impact of suicide across the population. This preventative approach must be driven through an equity lens that recognises the disproportionate impact of structural barriers and inequalities across society, and the ways in which these disparities continue to suicidal distress, prioritising efforts to address them. In conclusion, the relationship between the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Strategy and the National Suicide Prevention Strategy is one of complementary efforts, with each strategy enhancing the other to create a comprehensive approach to suicide prevention in Australia. By working together, these strategies aim to reduce suicide rates and improve mental health outcomes for all Australians, with a particular focus on the unique needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Thank you.
And thank you to Rachel for providing us with that video. Okay. So now we're going to move on, and I'm pleased to be joined by our panellists today. So I'm just going to introduce them. Firstly, we have Dr. Alan Woodward. Alan has worked in mental health and suicide prevention for 25 years and is an expert in crisis support. He's contributed to policy development for suicide prevention globally and nationally. He's chair of the advisory board of the National Suicide Prevention Office. He's director of policy for Lifeline International. He served as a National Mental Health Commissioner and as an elected board director with Suicide Prevention Australia. In 2022, he received the National Mental Health Prize, and in 2021 received a Life Award for for leadership in suicide prevention. I'm also pleased to be introducing Nevis Murray, whose career spans 35 years in human services. She is passionate about empowering people and communities to be the best they can be. For the past 6 years, Nevis has been the Chief Executive of Suicide Prevention Australia, the national peak body for suicide prevention. She is part of the advisory board for the National Suicide Prevention Office and sits on the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's Expert Advisory Group. So Alan and Nevis, thank you both for joining. I've got a few questions to pose to you both, but we'll hopefully also get to some Q&A from the audience as well. So I'm going to start by coming to you, Alan, and then over to you, Nevis. First question is, what do each of you see as critical to improving suicide prevention in Australia, and how do you see the strategy enabling this? So, Alan.
Yeah, thank you. So, I think one of the things that is critical is for us to have a shared understanding of suicidal behaviour and the factors that surround a person becoming suicidal. So the strategy puts forward a model, if you like, or a way of articulating what the factors are surrounding suicide, and that gives us the base from which to have a shared understanding. But what I mean by a shared understanding is, we have a common language. We understand together what are the key drivers around suicidal behaviour and therefore its prevention. And in this case, a more comprehensive, properly informed approach to suicidal behaviour. So we don't just burrow in on one aspect or another aspect. We understand the reality that suicidal behaviour is a very complicated behaviour. It relates, as you were saying, Susan, at the start, to individual journeys and experiences. And while there are some common things that we can address, we need to look at it in a more comprehensive approach. So I think it will go a long way to equipping policy makers and decision makers and governments, to those who are involved in the design and commissioning of services across a whole range of areas, whether it be health or social services or education or employment or economics. But also how the community appreciates the effort for suicide prevention and can support that through their own actions and advocacy. So to me, the strategy is a major step forward in simply providing that common understanding, that base from which we can go forward.
Thanks, Alan. Nevis, I guess, what do you see as critical to improving suicide prevention, and how do you see the strategy enabling this?
Yeah, look, Suicide Prevention Australia represents about 200 organisations that employ and work with about 140,000 volunteers and workers across the country, as well as 200 individuals, researchers and people with a lived experience. And certainly what we're hearing from our membership is that there are 4 critical elements that will ensure that we have a sustainable suicide prevention system in the country. And the strategy speaks directly into those 4 elements: a whole of government approach, the embedding of lived experience in everything that we do in suicide prevention, good data and evidence, and ensuring that we have a capable workforce across the country. So I think it's clear that as a sector, the suicide prevention sector is saying that what the strategy contains, in fact, meets what we believe we require to have a sustainable suicide prevention system in this country.
And I guess, how will it improve suicide prevention in Australia? And in essence, what will it mean in practical terms for people? Alan, do you want to go first again?
Well, I think one of the things that will mean in practical terms is that we anticipate the pickup points will be much broader in people's lives. If I can give an example, some years ago I was involved in a pilot study to look at how you can equip people who are at the front line, the reception desks and administrative support in the family court system, to identify people, clients of the court system who are in distress, and provide a quick, appropriate and compassionate response, and some information and referrals onto support services such as Lifeline or other services. Now, that was not what you'd call a terribly resource intensive or heavy program. It was a light touch, but it recognised that actually a lot of people who go through something to do with the family courts find it incredibly difficult and distressing. And a small proportion of those people may actually be feeling very suicidal at the time that they're standing in front of the person in the reception desk in the court. So we need to look at ways in which we just equip that person to be alert and be able to respond. And we have services that are sitting around that that can be used and encouraged to others. That in itself starts to break down some of the stigma. It starts to raise an understanding in the family court system around, suicide prevention is part of what they can do. And it means that we have a more ready and compassionate response to people who are experiencing distress through a particular area where they may be vulnerable. So that sort of thing, I think, could be replicated across a whole range of government and community services. It doesn't have to be all placed into the health system. The health system plays an incredibly important role. But I think what it means in practical terms is that people might experience the offer of a compassionate response, an alertness to what they're going through, and some indication of where they could get extra help at that time from a whole range of possibilities and things in their lives.
Thanks, Alan. Nevis, did you want to add in around practical, what you see it means practically to people?
Yes, I would actually. I think a really key point to draw out here is that it won't mean anything practically for anybody unless it's adopted as a strategy and we move beyond it being advice on a strategy. So I think that is a really crucial element that I'd like to draw out and urge everybody who can to advocate strongly for this strategy, which is a good strategy, to be adopted as such and not just be taken as advice. That's the first thing I'd like to say about that point. It's of no use to us unless it's implemented. If it is implemented, then I think it moves to creating a cultural shift across the country, across governments in respect of responsibility for suicide prevention. It is a blueprint, it's a framework, a roadmap for where to invest, how to invest in good suicide prevention in this country. It has the potential of being a unifying force across states and territories to ensure that we have a consistent approach to suicide prevention in Australia rather than a piecemeal approach. As Alan said, it lifts our vision beyond just health, even though health is important. If you look at Alan spoke about the family law court as an example. If you think about the implementation of robo-debt and the effects of robo-debt, if this strategy was in place, there's no way that robo-debt would have been rolled out in the manner in which it was. Something like it might have been, but there would have been protective factors put around for our community and lives would have been saved. So I think workforce planning is another really important aspect that this strategy will enable, a cohesive approach to workforce planning that gives us surety such that we can organise ourselves to deliver consistent services that meet the needs of people across our communities. So there's a whole host of benefits that will flow from the implementation of the strategy if it is implemented and moves beyond advice.
Thanks, Nevis. And my next question was going to be, why do we need it? But I think you've also answered it pretty beautifully in that. I might move on to ask, I guess, more broadly, how do each of you see the draft advice supporting the activities happening across states and territories and in the regions? Alan, did you want to go?
Yeah, I might just pick up on that and also off the back of some of Nevis's comments. You know, I think the other thing that the strategy does is it enlarges our expectations around suicide prevention from being beyond service provision, which is almost inevitably a reactive process, to one of anticipation and prevention at the most earliest points. And this is where it shifts suicide prevention from being simply a consideration around service provision and possibly community outreach to one of policy and influence, because governments make policy choices and decisions every day. Some of them are relatively minor and some of them are very substantial, but every policy choice or decision that is made has the possibility to support suicide prevention, because policy decisions impact on people's lives. Some of those policy decisions will not be particularly influential for suicide prevention, but some of them could be. And the strategy provides a basis for which policymakers and decision makers have a base to go back to and can be alert to the suicide prevention implications of the choices that are before them. In particular, the potential to look at how the impacts of policy choices on the population as a whole or on particular groups or geographic areas can be addressed in a way that identifies where people may have detrimental effects. If I could use one example, which is very close to my heart because I grew up in Wollongong in the Illawarra region, and many people would know it's a steel city. And when I was growing up in the 70s, you know, the steel works and the industry was huge and employed 30,000 odd people. Economic policy, environmental changes, a whole lot of factors came into place. And by the 1980s, the 30,000 people who were employed at the steelworks was reduced to almost half of that. So you had a massive change for thousands of people's lives. That was an economic policy opportunity to have looked particularly at the issues around suicide prevention. And there are some interesting retrospective reports that look at that time in Wollongong, my hometown, which show that actually not a lot was done for people. Not because people were callous, they just didn't think of it. They didn't think perhaps we should positively offer more support to people going through that massive change in industry and economic transition. And yes, there were lives lost to suicide during that time. So that would be tonight an example of where there is the ability now to look more at the policy-related aspects as well as the service provision aspects of suicide prevention.
Thanks, Alan. Nevis, I guess, how do you see the draft strategy supporting the activities happening across the states and territories and in the regions?
I think the strategy has a unifying effect for the states and the territories as well as the regions. I think one of the risks we run is that we're now starting to see activity at a state level. South Australia has introduced a Suicide Prevention Act. New South Wales is moving down that path fairly quickly. Tasmania similarly is looking at the introduction of an act. I think the risk we run as a country is that we will have a different system in every state. That means that it's a postcode lottery when it comes to supports that you might need should you move towards suicidal crisis. So I think having a unifying strategy at a national level will go a long way to ensuring that the country is moving together towards a safe place for people who might be experiencing suicidal crisis. As Alan says, it also helps to shift culture in that it's not just about government finding solutions or the health system finding solutions around suicide prevention. It's the community response to, everything that's happening. We know that the first time somebody tells their suicidal distress story can dictate whether they have a good outcome or a not so good outcome. If we have a community that understands their role in suicide prevention, has the basic skills to be able to support somebody who might be in distress such that they stay safe and can find the right supports should they need more complex supports, I think is that the strategy has the potential to enable all of that. That if we don't implement a strategy, we will have very localised responses that won't be consistent, and it will depend on where you are, whether you get good support or not.
Thanks, Nevis. And I guess as CEO of the peak body Suicide Prevention Australia, perhaps you can share with us a little about the efforts to achieve a whole of government approach to suicide prevention, and how does the draft advice on the strategy advance these efforts?
Yeah, great question, Susan. And look, I have to say that this work has been ongoing in this sector for a very long time, and I'm Johnny come lately on the scene comparative to the amount of work that's gone on over many, many years, decades. For 30 years, members of Suicide Prevention Australia have been talking about the need for a whole of government approach, a whole of community approach to suicide prevention. And so the efforts have been tremendous and sustained over that period of time from many people, some who are joining us today across the country. And I think the fact that we were able to establish the National Suicide Prevention Office in 2022 was a major milestone forward. The fact that the office has so actively pursued the development of this strategy in that 2-year period, again, I think has been a major step forward. And I mentioned earlier, at the state level, our members have been advocating strongly for some form of framework, and we're now starting to get things like Suicide Prevention Acts implemented across the states. So this has been a long, sustained effort from people working, dedicated people working in suicide prevention across the country, and we're finally at this point. So the opportunity for us to all unify behind the strategy and tell government very loudly that this is more than advice. This needs to be implemented as a strategy. It's international best practice. We hear the International Association for Suicide Prevention talk about best practice being having a strategy in your country. We're seeing the UK and the US already releasing their strategies. Let's not fall behind, and let's ensure that our community stays safe.
Thanks, Nevis. Alan, any final comments from you before we move to Q&A, or from both of you before we move to Q&A?
I would just throw in one thing, and I did notice one of the chat comments has thrown up the chart that I showed at the Adelaide conference. So maybe I will speak to that for just a moment. When we talk about suicide prevention as a public health concern, sitting behind the jargon terms there is the idea that we need to look at how we prevent suicide across a whole population of people. That we don't just focus our efforts in on what we could do by the time a person has either ended up in hospital or emergency services from a suicide attempt, or is about to run that risk in their life. That we actually look at the distress levels of people across the population and see if we can get in earlier to prevent those distress levels from further elevating. And I've worked in crisis support for a long time, and I've researched in that area. So I guess I have a particular understanding of what it is that can generate rising distress levels for a person. And it is those mixer factors that we're talking about. So the more that we put effort across that, we start to address larger numbers of people, and we start to be more effective in suicide prevention. So, when we think about the numbers, yes, we tragically have lost more than 3,000 lives to suicide in this country each year for now several years running. But sitting behind that are maybe 65, 70,000, 80,000 people who attempt to end their lives. And sitting back behind that, are several hundreds of thousands of people who have very elevated levels of distress and despair in their lives. So those are the large numbers that we're trying to reach. Because if we reach those large numbers of people and address that rising distress level, and there are so many ways in which we can do that, then we start to reduce the number of lives lost. And that's what that chart that I showed in Adelaide is all about. It's shifting the entire curve of the population back to the left, so there are less people who even get to the point where the intention to end their life has become a reality. And we reduce the suffering that sits behind suicide, because suicide ultimately can and should be understood as an expression of human suffering, profound, deep suffering, of that despair and distress, such to the point that a person is starting to find more reasons for dying than they are for living. And we don't want that in any society. Now, this is about someone else raised a question about what do you mean by a human rights approach? Well, the starting of the human rights approach comes from the UN Declaration that says all people have a human right to health and well-being. That's a very positive expression of a human right. And that's what we're seeking to uphold through this, is that everybody lives life to the very best they can and lives life to the fullest with maximum well-being. So, I think this is where the impact of this approach and outlook is so different from the fairly deficit-based reactive approach, which is simply running around trying to pick up pieces after tragedy has occurred.
Thanks, Alan. We've got 10 minutes left, so I think it would be great if we can try and address some of the questions that are coming through in Q&A and the chat. It's I'm trying to keep up with them a little bit on the side, but there's certainly some questions around workforce. Michael, I might also bring you back into the fold here as well. Darren's asked what provisions are being discussed for the training needs for our suicide prevention peer workforce, and I might even start with the answer to that, in that we've got some fabulous members of the peer workforce in the LEPG, and I know when we unpacked Critical Enabler 4 around a capable and integrated workforce, we discussed a lot of the perhaps barriers in that space around training, but also around organisational readiness for organisations to be ready to have a peer workforce. And I know there's another piece of work that the NSPO has also got that's going to be linked specifically to this. So Michael, perhaps you want to talk a little bit more about the workforce strategy as well.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So interestingly, in that critical enabler, I think what we pointed out is when you look at suicide prevention in this particular way, who we regard as being part of the suicide prevention workforce expands greatly. And so that's why the heart of that particular aspect of the strategy is recommending the development of a robust workforce, suicide prevention workforce strategy. But and I'll come back to that in a second, but what the strategy does do is actually just say, well, there are things that we can do in the interim. So in the absence of a broad strategy, we can actually focus on two particular areas, one of which is the peer workforce, and the second is general practice. And there are things we can do in those spaces right now, which would be immediately helpful. And so on the peer workforce piece, it's not just about thinking about how do we train people, but how do we support that training? How do we enable organizations to be capable to actually employ people, to sustain that workforce through adequate compensation, and also to ensure that there are kind of ongoing development opportunities. So that is a part of the strategy as is. But yeah, to your point about the broader workforce strategy, there's a lot more detail that we hope to unpack in developing the next, well, we've got two big pieces coming online for the Suicide Prevention Office. One is the outcomes framework, and the other is the workforce strategy, which we will be engaging in the same way with anyone and everyone to develop it.
Thanks, Michael. I guess there's quite a few questions there. I'm going to jump to one that's quite topical at the moment, I guess, and it's how will this strategy influence broader policies? So in particular at the moment, we know that the housing crisis is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds and affecting a lot of Australians. So I'm not sure who'd like to start with that one. Michael, did you want to?
Maybe I'll start, and please, Nevis and Alan, interrupt. I'll start by saying that first and foremost, what it does, and certainly there was a question around ministerial and portfolio engagement as well. Certainly what it does, and what our experience has been, is that when we start to talk to different portfolios about their role in suicide prevention through housing or gambling or whatever the issue is, there is an intuitive understanding in the government of and across governments of that connection. And what the strategy really does is really formalize some of those elements and gives people, I guess, an authorization to consider suicide as part of their work on housing or whatever the case may be. The second point I would say about it is one of the next pieces of work, which I mentioned in relation to the NSPO, is the development of an outcomes framework. Now, the outcomes framework, and this connects to some other questions about implementation and monitoring and reporting, the outcomes framework is really defining how do we measure progress in suicide prevention more effectively. Deaths and attempts are a pretty crude and retrospective way of looking at suicide deaths. So the outcomes framework uses this model presented in the strategy to start to look at these questions of what does progress look like in each of these areas and what are the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. Now, what that does then is allow us to move tracking of progress in suicide prevention upstream to some of these issues like housing and gambling and domestic family violence and child abuse and neglect, and to start to see where are the critical breakpoints in our whole government system. Where are these systemic failures appearing? And that gives us really the tools to focus very tightly in on some of these policy issues which are leading to distress and suffering and suicide attempts. And that gives us a really clear evidence base to take to governments and say, here is the evidence which links these outcomes to what we're seeing in suicide. So I think the strategy forms the basis of that outcomes framework. And that really is the big policy lever which will influence across all of these different areas of policy. And that's, to touch quickly on, that's something which someone else raised in the questions. Really, what defines the strategy and makes it different is that it gives us these levers that we have not had to date.
Thanks, Michael. Look, I'm very aware of time. We do have a lot of questions there, but the office is going to endeavour very much to add them into the FAQs on the consultation page. I do want to start to wrap it up there because I really want to do a bit of a call to action today. I want to thank Alan and Nevis for your contributions on the webinar today, and also through the process of the development of the strategy as chair and members of the advisory board. Thank you, Michael, for providing the overview on the strategy and why it's so important. I strongly encourage everyone who's online today to share and provide feedback on the strategy. As Neva said, as we are all saying, as people who have been intimately involved with it for the last couple of years, we really want this to be, to move on to be a strategy, not just an advice on a strategy. So we really encourage you strongly to provide feedback. The public consultation closes midnight on Sunday, the 27th of October. We're encouraging individuals, organisations, communities to provide feedback. You've got the QR code there, or you can go onto the NSPO website. If you're a community and you're hoping to provide collective feedback, there's also a document on the consultation page where you can actually facilitate a workshop and provide collective feedback. And once everyone's feedback has been given, there will also be a report summarising that feedback, which will be made publicly available. But finally, I just want to acknowledge also that discussions like today, whilst positive steps for suicide prevention reform, can also be difficult to hear. So we'll also leave you with some support lines there, or access your preferred support services. Please take care of yourselves, and thank you all so much for joining the webinar today.
And thank you, everyone. An overwhelming number of questions and discussion in the chat. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to spend answering all these questions, because there are some that I would love to engage with people on and discuss further, but we will try our best to get back to you, each and every one of you. But thank you so much for your enthusiastic participation. It really is makes a huge difference. So have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone.